It was the morning of my retirement party, and something felt off before I even got out of bed. I'd been retired for exactly 1 year, from 32 years as a civil engineer, the kind of work that teaches you to look at a structure and know immediately when something's wrong. A hairline crack in the foundation. A load-bearing wall that's been quietly shifting for months. You learn to read the signs before the whole thing comes down. I should have applied that same instinct to my own family. My son had organized the party. That was the first thing that should have told me something. He'd never organized anything in his life. Not his college applications, not his wedding, not his finances. My daughter-in-law was the engine behind everything they did, and she was the kind of woman who did nothing without a reason. But I was 68 years old, and it was a Sunday morning in October, and the maple in the backyard had turned the color of a good bourbon, and I wanted to believe my son had done something kind for his father. I made coffee. I stood at the kitchen window for a while. The house was quiet in the way houses get when you've lived in them alone for a long time. Not lonely exactly, just settled. My wife, Norma, had passed 3 years before. Pancreatic cancer. 6 weeks from diagnosis to the end. I still made 2 cups of coffee some mornings before I caught myself. The party was set for 2 o'clock at my son's house, about 20 minutes away. I had a few hours. I read the paper. I fed the dog. I did the things I always do. At around 10, my son called. "Dad, you all set for today?" "I'm set," I said. "Great. Hey, listen, don't bring anything. We've got everything covered." That was the second thing. It was too casual. The way someone is casual when they've rehearsed being casual. "I wasn't planning to bring anything," I said. Right. Okay, see you at 2. He hung up before I could say goodbye. I put the phone down on the counter and stood there for a moment. The dog looked up at me. I looked at him. "Something's wrong," I told him. He thumped his tail once and went back to sleep. My son is 41. His name is not important. What matters is that he is my only child, and for a long time, that felt like enough. Norma and I had wanted more kids, but it didn't happen, and we poured everything into him. Good schools, a college fund, a down payment on his first house, a loan, technically, though we never pressed him on it. $50,000. He'd said he'd pay it back when he got on his feet. He never got on his feet, exactly. He changed jobs often. Sales, mostly. The kind where the income is always just about to get good. His wife was steadier. She worked in real estate, and she was sharp and well-dressed, and always seemed to be calculating something just behind her eyes. I don't say that to be uncharitable. Some people are just built that way, always thinking 3 steps ahead. Usually I respect it. In her case, I should have been more careful about what she was thinking ahead toward. When Norma died, they came to the funeral and they stayed for a week to help me get sorted, and I was grateful. I thought we'd turned a corner as a family. I thought the shared grief had brought us closer. What I didn't know then was that my daughter-in-law had started looking into estate planning about a month after the funeral. Not for her own family. For mine. I found out by accident the way most things like this come out. It was a Thursday in late August, about 2 months before the retirement party. I'd driven to their house to drop off a piece of furniture, a sideboard that had been my mother's, that my son had always liked. I hadn't called ahead because I was already in the neighborhood, and it was the middle of a workday, and I figured nobody would be home. The front door was unlocked. That happened sometimes. Their neighborhood was quiet, and they were careless about it. I'd told them before. I not called out, got no answer, and let myself in to leave the sideboard in the entryway. I just set it down when I heard them in the kitchen. They must not have heard me knock. My son's voice first, lower than usual. The way he gets when he's uncomfortable. It's his money, though. It doesn't feel right. And then my daughter-in-law, steady and flat. It's going to be ours, eventually anyway. We're just moving the timeline. I went very still. He's not going to sign something like that. He will if we set it up right. The party is a good opportunity. Get him relaxed. Get him feeling sentimental. I've already talked to the attorney. A pause. Then my son again, quieter. What kind of attorney helps with this? The kind I found. Don't worry about it. Just be warm to him. Make him feel like we're doing this because we love him. I stood in their entryway with my hand on my mother's sideboard and listened to my son agree. I walked back out the way I came. I pulled the door shut quietly behind me. I sat in my truck in front of their house for about 4 minutes, staring at nothing in particular. Then I called my attorney. Not their attorney, mine. A man I'd worked with for 20 years drew up my will, handled the property transfers when Norma died. A careful, methodical man who did not alarm easily. He was alarmed. Don't sign anything, he said. Don't let them get you in front of a notary. If they bring up finances at this party, get up and walk away. What are they trying to do? Based on what you've described, it sounds like they want you to sign over power of attorney or execute a trust that puts your assets under their management. If the attorney they've hired specializes in elder law, and they're approaching it the way your daughter-in-law described, recreating a sentimental environment, making it feel like a loving gesture, that's a known playbook. A playbook? Unfortunately, yes. I asked him what I should do. He told me. It took 3 weeks and several conversations and a fair amount of paperwork, but by the time October came around and my son called to make sure I wasn't bringing anything to my own retirement party, everything was already done. Everything that mattered was already protected. The party was at their house. About 20 people, neighbors, a couple of my old colleagues, some people I half recognized and some I didn't. My daughter-in-law had set out a nice spread. There was a banner. Someone had framed a photograph of me at my first job site, 22 years old and squinting into the sun. I ate, I talked, I laughed at the right moments. My son kept looking at me with something he was trying to make look like warmth. I looked back at him and kept my face easy. Around 4 o'clock, when the crowd had thinned and people were drifting toward the door, my daughter-in-law touched my arm. Can we sit down for a few minutes? Just the 3 of us? Of course, I said. We sat at the dining room table. She'd cleared a space at the head of it. My son sat across from me. She sat beside him. There was a manila folder on the table that hadn't been there before. She talked for a few minutes about family and legacy and how much I meant to them, and how she knew Norma would have wanted to know I was taken care of. She was good at it, I'll say that. She had a warmth in her voice that she could turn on like a faucet. If I hadn't been standing in their entryway 2 months earlier, I might have believed every word. She slid the folder across to me. We just want to simplify things for you, she said. This is a durable power of attorney. It would let us help manage things if anything ever happened. Health, finances, the property. You'd still be in control. We'd just be there to help. My son nodded. He was gripping the edge of the table. I opened the folder. I read the first page slowly. Then I looked up. Who drafted this? I asked. An estate attorney, she said. We can answer any questions. I'd like the attorney's name. A small pause. We can get you that information. I'd also like my attorney to review it before I sign anything. Another pause. Longer this time. Of course, she said. Her voice hadn't changed, but something behind her eyes had shifted. We're not trying to pressure you. I know you're not, I said. I'd still like him to look at it. I folded the papers back into the folder and set it on my side of the table. My son opened his mouth. My daughter-in-law put her hand briefly on his arm, and he closed it again. Take all the time you need, she said. I took the folder home. My attorney already knew it was coming. What I hadn't told them, what I had not told anyone outside of my attorney's office, was what I'd done in those 3 weeks after I overheard them in the kitchen. The house, first. My primary residence had been retitled into a trust I controlled, with a successor trustee who was not my son and not his wife. It was a neighbor of mine, a retired judge I'd known for 15 years, who had agreed without asking many questions because he is that kind of man. The accounts next. My savings and investments had been restructured with beneficiary designations that went directly to a charitable foundation Norma and I had established years ago, with a small percentage earmarked for my son. Enough to be meaningful, not enough to be a windfall. My attorney called it a modest inheritance in the language of the documents. I called it what he'd actually earned. The property in Vermont. There's a cabin up there, 40 acres, that had been in my family since my father bought it in 1971. My daughter-in-law had mentioned it once, casually. The way she mentioned things she'd already looked up, I transferred it to my nephew, who lives in Burlington, and who I trust completely, and who had no idea any of this was happening. I called him afterward and explained. He was quiet for a long moment. "Uncle," he said, "I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry," I said. "Just take care of the property." The power of attorney they presented me with at the dining room table, the one drawn up by the attorney they'd found, was drafted broadly enough that, if I'd signed it, they would have had authority over all of it. The house, the accounts, the cabin, the ability to make medical decisions on my behalf. Everything Norma and I had spent 40 years building, handed over in a single notarized signature over a party tray and a framed photograph. My attorney read it and called it aggressive. He used other words too, privately, that I won't repeat here. They called 3 days after the party. My son this time. My daughter-in-law had drafted what to say. I could hear the formality in it. The way he chose words he'd never normally use. "We were just hoping you'd had a chance to look it over. We really think it makes sense for the family." "I gave it to my attorney," I said. A pause. "Okay, what did he say?" "He had some concerns." "What kind of concerns?" "He'll be in touch with your attorney," I said. "I think that's the right way to handle it." The line went quiet for a moment. Then, "Dad, we're not trying to. This isn't what you're thinking." "What am I thinking?" He didn't answer. "I love you," I said. "I hope you know that. But I'm not signing anything that hasn't been reviewed by someone working for me." He said he understood. He sounded like someone who did not understand at all, and also like someone who had just realized the plan wasn't going to work. They did not contact me again for several weeks. When they did, it was a short call to say they'd be spending Thanksgiving with her family in Oregon. First time in 12 years they hadn't spent it with me. I spent Thanksgiving with my neighbor, the retired judge, and his wife, and their 3 grandchildren, and a golden retriever named something I could never pronounce. We ate too much and watched football, and nobody tried to hand me any legal documents. It was the best Thanksgiving I'd had in years. In the spring, my son called again. Not with a plan this time. I could tell the difference now. He called the way he used to call when he was 17 and needed to talk about something he'd done wrong. Halting, circling around it. "I think I made a mistake," he said finally. I waited. "She told me it was just helping you, that you'd want it if you understood what it meant, that it was the responsible thing to do." A pause. I knew it wasn't right. I knew it the whole time. "Then why did you go along with it?" He didn't have a good answer. I didn't expect one. There are things people do for their spouses that they can't quite explain, and there are things people do out of greed that they dress up in other language until they almost believe it themselves. In my son's case, I think it was some of both, and I think he lived with it badly. "Is there anything left to fix?" he asked. "Not legally," I said. "It's already handled." Another pause. "I meant with us." I thought about Norma, and about the morning she was diagnosed, and how I'd held her hand in the car on the way home from the doctor's office and told her we would figure it out. We had not figured it out. She had died, and I had kept going, the way you do. I thought about the maple in my backyard and the 2 cups of coffee I still made sometimes before I caught myself. "Yes," I said, "there's something left to fix, but it'll take time." He said he understood. This time, I thought he might actually mean it. That was 18 months ago now. My daughter-in-law no longer calls. I've heard through the family that things between them have been difficult, though. I don't ask and I don't involve myself. What happens in that marriage is between them. My son comes over on occasional Sunday mornings. He doesn't stay long, an hour, sometimes 2. We drink coffee and talk about nothing much. Sports, usually. The news. He asked me once about the cabin in Vermont, and I told him my nephew was taking care of it. And he nodded and didn't ask again. He has not apologized directly. I haven't asked him to. Some things between fathers and sons don't work through spoken words. They work through showing up over time. And I think he understands that now. The house is still mine. The accounts are structured the way I want them. The cabin had a good winter. My nephew sent me pictures of it in the snow. The old stone chimney unchanged since 1971. The same stand of birch trees my father used to point out to me when I was young. I look at those pictures sometimes in the evening when the house is quiet and the dog is asleep, and there's nothing on the television worth watching. I spent 40 years building things meant to last. The ones that mattered I made sure are still standing. I've been thinking about what my father used to say when I was young. He'd look at whatever I'd built. A birdhouse, a model bridge, something out of scrap wood. And he'd say, "The thing tells you everything about the person who made it." He meant it as a compliment then, but I've come to understand it cuts both ways. What my son and his wife built in secret told me everything I needed to know. Not because they wanted my money. Greed is old and ordinary, and I don't hold it against people the way I once might have, but because of the care they put into the deception. The attorney, the party, the folder on the dining room table. The warmth in her voice that she could turn on and off like a switch. That took planning. That took a willingness to look at someone who loves you and see only an obstacle. There's a kind of clarity that comes when you realize someone has made a calculation about you. Not a mistake. A calculation. It doesn't feel the way you'd expect. It doesn't feel like rage. It feels quiet and very specific, like a crack you finally located in a wall you thought was solid. What I did in the weeks after I overheard them wasn't revenge. I want to be clear about that. I didn't restructure my estate to punish anyone. I did it because I understood, finally, that protecting what you've built is its own form of integrity. Norma and I didn't spend 40 years being careful so that someone else's plan could override ours in an afternoon. That's the thing nobody tells you about getting older. People assume that wisdom is just knowing more. It isn't. Wisdom is knowing what to do with what you know, and then having the patience to do it quietly, without announcing yourself, without needing anyone to see it happen. My daughter-in-law thought she was dealing with a sentimental old man who could be softened up with a banner and a framed photograph. She wasn't wrong that I'm sentimental. She was wrong about what that meant. The part that stayed with me longest wasn't the folder on the table. It was my son's voice in that kitchen. It doesn't feel right. And then watching him go along with it anyway. That's the thing about character. It doesn't announce itself in the big moments. It shows up in the small ones, when nobody's watching, when there's something to gain from looking the other way. He knew it was wrong. He said so out loud. And then he sat across from me at that dining room table and nodded. I don't tell that part to condemn him. I tell it because I think he's going to spend a long time sitting with it, and I think that sitting with it is the only way through. The Sunday mornings when he comes over now, the coffee, the nothing much conversation, that's not nothing. That's him choosing something different, 1 week at a time. I'm 68 years old. I've outlasted a career, a marriage that was the best thing in my life, and now this. The house is still mine. The cabin is still in the family. The accounts are where I put them. What my son and his wife tried to take was never really available. You can't sign away what's already been protected. And I don't just mean the paperwork. I mean the 40 years of showing up and doing things right and knowing what matters and why. That doesn't transfer. That doesn't go in a folder. That's mine.